All right, my friends, welcome back to another V Rising video. This is going to be a video analyzing every single one of the artifact weapons and how they work and how well they do in PvP as well as PvE in the 1.1 patch. Now, there were some pretty substantial changes to weapon balance overall, and on top of that, with the addition of the stat system and the ways that passives work, things have changed quite a bit for a lot of different weapons. So let's go ahead and jump into this really quickly. I'm going to be starting with the Gravecaller here. This one is a super fun one. It's funny because in the 1.0 patch, this weapon was somewhat a meme. I mean, it was fine in open world and PvP, but in terms of like actual, what your preference, this one wasn't really one that you would kind of pick up. However, because of a few buffs and changes, this thing is now one of the strongest artifact weapons overall. It hits like as hard as pretty much anything you can imagine, simply because of a few changes. One of those was the shockwave right here. The initial hit on the E was buffed by 30% damage, from 70% to 30%, or sorry, to 100%. On top of that, the Gravecaller specifically does an additional 20% bonus damage on the 3 hits that you do whenever you recast it. So each of those hits was buffed by is buffed by 20% compared to a regular sword E. So the reason this is so strong is that is now 220% physical damage on a single weapon. On top of that, it has true combos into other weapons. Then whenever you get into the idea of all the different stats we have, specifically the addition of weapon skill power, the ability to get so much weapon skill power, we're at 140% maxed out here. It makes it so this thing can hit ridiculously hard. So just to give you an idea about how hard it can hit, we're going to see if we can't get this thing to crit here. I'm going to apply Leech to this thing. I'm going to dash, and then I'm going to use E. 189. And you can see all the way through that, it was another like 140. There weren't too many crits on that E, but we're going to do one more time. 189. And right there, there's another 82 and 91. So, I mean, we are almost at 400 damage. I would argue this is a best in slot weapon for swords. The only thing to consider otherwise is if you specifically are picking sword for the Q, but the thing is, this thing already does, so essentially whenever you pick it for the Q, you're picking it for anti-counter, because this Q pierces counters. And generally for that, you want static, because those static procs, it hits so many times, the static procs does a lot of damage. However, with Condemn, it is kind of the second best thing you can have, and there's so many things, elemental effects going around with things like coatings. It's not hard to like slap static on like a pistol or something and just tag it like this, and in PvE, I mean, this thing's amazing in PvE. I would suggest pairing it with an AoE skill, something like Void or Aftershock or Reign of Chaos, so that you can essentially just do a AoE like this, so you weaken up some of the enemies, and then you come through and you Q on top of them, and so if you kill one of them, it kind of chains it into the next into another enemy kill. So if you don't know how it works, essentially, if you kill somebody with Whirlwind, it increases the duration by 1 second, up to 3 seconds. Okay, next thing we're talking about is Apocalypse. This thing is super cool, looks amazing, honestly. Love how this thing looks. And overall, the benefits that this thing gives is it makes it so the Q does bonus damage to ignited targets, and the E spawns a lesser aftershock that deals 80% damage in a line and ignites the target. So the idea is you're igniting them, then you do bonus damage with the Q. Overall, in PvP, this thing is fine. It's definitely not best in slot. I would say it's definitely it's good. It's definitely a usable thing. However, I would really only recommend using it if you're running something like Power Surge or other chaos spells, because using E as a way to apply that chaos is just not really reliable in PvP because it's so reactable and so predictable. So the idea would be using something like Power Surge, so you hit them, and then you Q, and do 239 damage off of a greatsword Q. And the thing about greatswords, the reason I'm saying it's definitely not BIS, is because the Q normally does not have an infusion. So if you hit that thing, it has no infusion. And greatsword is highly valued generally in PvP for its infusion effects, where if you apply like a chill or a weaken to it, you can do stuff like this, and then you could swap off to Siren's Wail and do a true combo there. Greatsword Q, Siren's Wail E, if this had weaken infusion on it. You could even do something like Frostbat, where you like chill Greatsword into Frostbat for a freeze that way. That's another thing you can do. And since this weapon doesn't have any infusion, that is kind of off the table. Another thing to note, the E on Aftershock. So E in general was buffed from 100 to 125%. They took 25% from the Q, slapped onto the E. Again, it's very telegraphed for PvP. However, something interesting about the Apocalypse is that the Aftershock damage scales with magic damage or magic power, how much spell power you have. So that means that if you could find ways to use this, you're technically having another ability to cast some kind of spell. The issue is, again, like I said, it's very reactable, so it's not always the greatest thing in PvP. However, I guess one thing you could probably argue is, like, if you're in a situation where you're in a raid and you're kind of at the top of a staircase, it kind of gives you another thing you can throw down a staircase like that, which is kind of cool. In PvE, however, this thing is amazing. Honestly, it's really, really good because you can imagine if there's a big group of enemies all around like this, you can kind of just hit them with this. They both get Aftershock, then you Q on top of them, and they both take bonus damage. All right, next thing we're talking about is the 1,000 Storms. This thing is so good, honestly. This thing's amazing. It was already amazing in the 1.0 patch. I would say this is probably best in slot overall for spears. I mean, I guess there's some ways you might be able to, I don't know, this is best in slot. This has to be best in slot right now. The only reason you would not pick this specifically, in my opinion, to be honest, is if you wanted a regular spear for the harpoon to be able to, instead of pull you to them, to pull them to you if you're in like a raid situation or like a team fight where you're trying to like pull somebody into you, right? But regardless, what the 1,000 Storms does is the Q, now it launches a lesser ball lightning that periodically shocks and deals a total of 25% magic damage. Keep in mind that scales similarly to Apocalypse, which has the 80% bonus damage or 80% damage Aftershock. Same thing, it's only 25%. However, you have to understand spears hit stupidly hard because not only is it doing the ball lightning, it's also proccing static procs on every single one of these hits. That's why it just did 300 something damage total, and I'm not even fully built for it. Yes, that's a very strong thing, and obviously, again, it's really cool because this means, because it scales off magic power, or magic damage a little bit, it means that casters actually like this just a little bit more than they did before. They really have a strong thing here with just a little bit bonus damage. And then the E got a buff on the E here, so it's up to 110% physical damage. I think it was up from like 90% physical damage, so the E got a little bit of a buff, which is really, really nice. And the other thing about this, let's see if I can use it over here. I think about the 1,000 Storms specifically is if you use the E on a piece of geometry like this, you can pull yourself around like Spider-Man kind of. So I want you to imagine you're like playing a caster build and you're casting like this and somebody's closing the gap. Well, if you have to get away really quickly, you can actually do that to reposition. And if they don't have that as well, they can't follow you. Kind of an interesting way to use that. PvE, this thing is absolutely insane. I mean, it's so good. Obviously, it doesn't have a crazy high AoE, specifically like a really big one. But Spear is just so strong because of the stagger effect. So if you're in like rifts or something, maybe you're running something like a void, you can suck things in and then. So, and it's great for bossing as well. I mean, Spear is just really strong for bossing. You don't have an iframe, but it is really, really good. Okay, so Red Twins. Red Twins is absolutely ridiculous. This thing is just so strong. I actually can't believe this thing didn't get nerfed between 1.0 and now. The only change this thing got, which is a fairly substantial change, but the only change it got is that the E no longer incapacitates in any way, which is kind of sad because there was some really cool combos you could do with it. But regardless, doesn't really matter. I mean, honestly, incap being gone is sad. However, this thing is still just insane because for whatever reason, that that was determined to be all the nerf this thing needed. And this thing does absolutely ridiculous damage. Let's go ahead and Veil. I'm going to Veil so I can guarantee my crit here, just to show you exactly how much damage this thing does. I mean, it's just So that's 400 damage essentially with that, without the proper boosts from passives and other setup like Blood Rage and coding effects and all that kind of stuff. So it is very, very, very strong. Um, Overall, I would say this thing's best in slot. The only reason I would pick an axe that isn't Red Twins is if you specifically want an infusion on your Q, or, which probably you don't, or if you want an axe E to incapacitate, so you can do like chain combos with things like freeze, where you like chill somebody, right, and you freeze them, and then you hit them with a normal axe E to stun them, and then you can, you know, hit them with a crossbow shot or spell or whatever it is you're going to use, right? Very, very strong in that regard. But otherwise, if you're going pure physical, just use these things. They hit so hard, it's like kind of a joke. I mean, 454 damage. Okay. And then the Q is just insane as well, because like I said, while it isn't infused with anything, it really doesn't matter, because what happens if you don't know anything about how the Q works is that essentially it gives you a 25% movement speed boost and a 50% attack speed boost, but it only lasts for 1 second. And that's if you land the Q. So you land the Q, you get a really big movement speed boost for a second, and then it goes away. You can also get a really, really, really big attack speed boost. However, with Red Twins, it adds a second to that frenzy. So it makes it so crazy how much damage you can pump out with that. Generally, what you would do is you would swap to another weapon, something that hits really hard with its primary attacks, like a great sword or a twin blade, and you could do something like this. Like that. Okay, and then PvE, these things are absolutely insane for mobbing. I mean, they're absolutely ridiculous. They're so strong. You can see the AoE here. Imagine you're in Mortium and you just obliterate an entire wave with 1E, and then also the Q is really good because you can do this as well, like I already showcased. So you can kind of just throw the E out and then throw the Q out and then destroy, just go to town. All right, next up, we are on the Endbringers. These things are still best in slot for PvP. I mean, for pistols, they just are the best. I don't really see why you would ever not want to be able to do 2Es. The damage overall with these things can be kind of off the charts if you get them both to crit and you're using, like, you know, the perfect setup. I've seen them do some very disturbing amounts of damage. Let's see if I can get them both to crit here. I mean, that was a non-crit for 200 damage. That was 281 on that one. For the single one, that wasn't even a double crit, you know. So these things can do some serious damage if everything crits all at once. And then the Q is just not something you care about for PvP almost at all. There's some very niche moments whenever you can use it. It's just, you never use this for PvP, or the Q for PvP in general. PvE, these things are just so good. For bossing, they're best in slot. It's between these and the Wraithblades. Wraithblades are going to do overall more damage for bossing and PvE in general. And I would say that Endbringers are probably going to be safer in general because the pistol E is just so useful. You have so much control over where you go with that E, and the instant iframe is just really, really strong, and the range, the poke. Okay, so yes, very, very strong. So next thing we're going to talk about is the Siren's Wail. Siren's Wail got some changes. The weakened Greatsword Q into Siren's Wail E. A lot of people were crutching on that at the end of 1.0. It was kind of just the thing that everyone was going to because it was just so incredibly powerful. Do a Greatsword Q into a Siren's Wail E and just fear them, and then left click them while they're feared and just do a total of like 400 damage. It was really, really disgusting. So that was changed. However, now this thing is actually still very strong. Instead of, the way they changed it is that instead of the E, you know, normally a snapshot on a crossbow will snare the target. It'll interrupt them and snare the target. However, on this one, instead of snaring them, it actually it does the opposite. It increases their movement speed, and the fear duration also got massively nerfed. So what happens is now whenever you do that Greatsword, or whenever you fear them, whatever, Greatsword Q into Siren's Wail E, whatever it may be, you can also do like a Reaper Q. Whenever you do that kind of thing, you will, they'll just run away from you, right? So what's really good about that is a different way to play. So instead of having this guaranteed huge damage combo, now you have a still very strong damage combo if you do like a Greatsword into Siren's Wail E. Strong damage combo, but you can also use it as a very good get off me tool. What that means is, imagine somebody's, you know, trying to attack you, they're getting all close. If you have a weakened Reaper, you could do something like Q, right? And then whenever they come out of the Q, you immediately hit them with a Siren's Wail E, and you knock them back, and then they just run off into Narnia. So overall, this thing is a very, very strong for PvP still, very solid thing. And what's also really good because of the weapon coatings, you can also have a single coating. You don't have to run beacon on anything else if you don't want to. You can have this as a poke tool to just apply the weaken and then fear them away. So that's also just so strong, especially if you don't want to run weaken on anything else. It's just so nice to have that convenience of poking somebody and then just fishing for that. I mean, that's 191 damage still off of that Siren's Wail E, which is just preposterously large. Siren's Wail in PvE. A crossbow in PvE is very strong. It's going to be one of the best things overall for PvE because it has so much damage at range. It's very safe because it shoots so far away. You can just use this to just kite the enemy like this all the way around, however long you want to go. And on top of that, Siren's Wail Q shoots 2 additional bolts like this, meaning if it's a really big boss, something like Winged Horror or any other big hitbox boss, you're going to hit it 2 additional times. That's 40% per bolt. You're going to hit it 2 additional times, and it applies Weaken, which is really good if you're running a spell. Something like Spiritual Infusion, giving you bonus damage to weakened enemies, also makes it very nice. So you hit this, and then you hit an E, right? If you want to, that's for bonus damage there. You hit all this, you're still kiting, etc. Super, super strong. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and Hand of Winter. This thing got somewhat of a nerf here. The way they got it nerfed is that the E, the smack, no longer incapacitates. And it now will only apply chill or consume chill to freeze for 2 seconds. And a lot of people are like, oh man, that sucks so bad. It's just totally nerfed, totally unusable. I actually completely disagree. And the reason for that is there's so many coatings going around, so many instances of chill going around with things like Frostbat, things like Frost Barrier, things like chill coatings that you can very easily just keep chill on top of somebody. And then whenever they get close, swing like that to freeze them and then hit them with the Greatsword Q, or the Greatsword Q, the Mace Q for the 125% bonus damage, which is just so much damage. However, one thing to note is because of one of the most prominent passives in the game at endgame now, one of the strongest ones here, Bastion, which reduces damage taken by 25% when someone is affected by a crowd control effect. This thing actually gets really heavily punished for that. So if you freeze somebody, you hit them with this, but they have Bastion, they're actually going to have a 25% damage reduction off whatever you do. And then PvE, I mean, Mace is fine for PvE. Obviously, knockback, really good. It's a good way to apply Chilled in a giant group for Cold Soul. That's really useful. The other thing, though, is Mace in general for me. I have never really been a Mace fan for PvE. I mean, the Q is great for mobbing. It's fine on bossing. But overall, I've never really been a Mace fan for PvE. It just feels a little too slow, a little too unwieldy for me. I'm used to going a little bit faster. But regardless, I mean, this thing's really good, especially if you apply chill to or freeze to mobs. However, just keep in mind you can't freeze bosses, so this bonus damage doesn't work. And next, we are going to Morningstar. So this thing, really, really strong still. Now, one thing to note on this is that, so burn in general is really good. It just is. So this right here, the burn, it's not going to do anything on these because they don't have HP, but burn is a mini percentage of their max HP. I can't remember what the exact number is. I think it's like 2% or something, 1.5%. I can't remember exactly of their max HP. So burn is always going to be good on both the Q and the E for PvE and for PvP and for raid defense, where like a golem comes up and they have like 4,000 HP. You hit them with this and it's just going to melt them so much faster that way. That's really, really strong. However, something to keep in mind, the Morningstar got a subtle nerf because, in a way, because previously the Morningstar had, for open world, had like best in slot stats all the time. And now, obviously you could get that eventually with whips, with the regular whip, but it was very unlikely to get in an open world setting to get a perfect whip. But now you can kind of just craft any whip to a perfect setting. So in that regard, it's a little bit nerfed, if that makes sense. Because essentially normal whips, you want them for the entangle. right, on the E here, and this one doesn't have that entangle. But regardless, other than, you know, if you don't really care about that all that much, you just want to hit really hard and do a bunch of damage with like dots and burns, this thing still hits very hard, does big damage, and burns. And then in PvE, the whip is just, it's so good. Morningstar is, I would argue, just best, not even argue, it just absolutely is best in slot for PvE because you don't care about entangle. You want to burn. I already mentioned his percentage max HP, which is amazing for bossing and still very good for other things that have a lot of HP. So overall, this thing is very, very good for open world PvE. Cloud Dancers. Cloud Dancers got a minor nerf. Actual Q itself does 20% less damage per hit now. So instead of dealing 210% physical damage and static damage, it does 150% physical damage with that static damage. So overall, a little bit of a nerf, but I mean, it's just still very strong. So one thing on that, and then on top of that, the E actually got buffed. So instead of consuming static to make a storm shield, the lesser storm shield, which was just so horrible, now instead it does 50% bonus damage to static enemies. So if we go ahead and do this, 196 damage off of that camouflage. You can see just how crazy powerful that is for a crit. That's so much damage. So overall, Cloud Dancer is still extremely powerful for PvP, just really, really good, especially if you're playing more aggressively. It's somewhat personal preference which ones you use, whether it's Cloud Dancers, a regular pair, or Wings of the Fallen. However, if you're playing very aggressively, I would suggest using Cloud Dancers. Really, it's nice to have like a safe approach like this. Right, so instead of ending back here, you can end up here. But again, that's kind of personal preference. I actually don't usually like to run them because I really enjoy being able to do things like wall bounces like this with a regular pair of slashers. And then in PvE, Cloud Dancers are strong. I mean, the Q hits through mobbing. This is a lot of damage. It is really good on bossing as well. And then having that bonus damage if you want is strong as well. The slashers in general for bossing are strong, because the E can drop aggro and give you really long cooldowns like this. Big window to gain your cooldowns back. So Slasher is really strong for that reason. Speaking of that, let's go ahead and go over to our next pair of slashers, the Wings of the Fallen. This is the next weapon on our list of things that scale off of spell power. These are your caster's best friend in terms of slashers. The change that this got is now the Q doesn't just apply leech, but instead at the end point, it casts a small blood fountain that does 40% damage and heals for 40%. So this is a double dipping thing here as well. And if you are running a spell power build, this is amazing for you because that 40% bonus damage scales for you perfectly. On top of that, the Vampiric Curse on the E. So the E did get lightly nerfed for move speed. Instead of doing giving you an additional 15% bonus move speed whenever you press E, that no longer happens. However, the Vampiric Curse happens, and you now can incapacitate with this. Before, it would not incapacitate at all. It would just do the Vampiric Curse, so you couldn't quite take advantage of it that way. However, now you have Vampiric Curse that does an additional 100% spell power and leeches 30% of the damage dealt after 3 seconds. So you can see how running a spell power build on this is essentially having another spell applying this Vampiric Curse, right? And there's 49 damage, essentially having another spell. So you can see how that would be really strong on a spell power build that has, 60 spell power or something with big scaling, and then that thing pops, does a lot of damage there, and then you're also having like chill things going on, right? Everything's doing tons of damage, and then that thing pops for even more damage. So overall, amazing for even in just physical stuff. It's also they're also strong as well. So in mobbing, same thing as the as Cloud Dancers. I would probably say Cloud Dancers overall are going to be better because the static is really strong. However, if you're running a caster thing, these are still going to be good because that, AoE like this is great to have as some additional damage. And then the Vampiric Curse for bossing is really is strong as well because, again, like I said, the E is good for dropping aggro and giving cooldowns. And then you hit them with this for some solid damage, and if you're a caster, it does more damage on the Vampiric Curse. Next up, we have the Talons of the Lich Beast. I went over these pretty in-depth in my claw guide, my claw breakdown, but just a really quick recap, these things are best in slot claws, in my opinion, unless you specifically want something on the Q. If you want the Q to have like static or something on it, then that would be better. But I would just say don't worry about that. You can just put a coating on something if you really want it that bad, because these things are wild. 25% chance on both of your weapon. The way it works is both of your weapon skills have a 25% chance to summon a skeleton warrior affected by agony. The way those skeleton warriors affected by agony work, they are the skelly bombs, the same things you get from things like Word of the Damned with the Skelly Bomb Jewel. They deal 80% magic damage when they blow up in an AoE. So these things are great for both spell power and even just physical builds because of that reason, because 80% spell power is a lot of spell power. And just passively having those things, those skeletons, is a great way to get passive damage and additional threats because the explosion hits through counters for PvP. And on top of everything I just said, if you consume Puncture with either of these, if you consume that Puncture, it will heal 25% of your spell power on top of applying Condemn. So already that's just better than regular consuming Puncture. So these things are great. PvE, amazing. Claws are so strong for PvE, it's kind of ridiculous. I was able to, with a non-legendary variant, with a blue variant, I think it was Static Claws blue variant, Merciless Iron tier. At level 63, I was able to kill Brutal Matka. So I was 16 levels lower just with Claws. And I was able to kill Brutal Matka. These things are extremely good at PvE, bossing, and also they are unbelievably powerful in mobbing because you apply all these stacks to a big AoE, and then you hit them all at once, and they all detonate on top of each other and do hilarious amounts of damage. Next thing we're going to go over is one of my favorites. Oh, my babies, the Wraithblades. I love these things so much. Wraithblades are, if you again have these broken down in my dagger video, these are best in slot daggers by far. They do just unreal damage if you have full stacks of Phantasm. They do unreal damage. There's 9 there. Let's go ahead and recall them here. Now we're at 10, and we'll do one more. There we go. Now we can do this. You can just see where that damage starts to stack up. So again, the way they work is the Q scales off Phantasm stacks. With 12 Phantasm stacks, we get 36% bonus damage on every dagger of our Q. You just see, I mean, there's just huge numbers popping up everywhere. And then the E has a 33% chance for every dagger to give you a Phantasm stack. So it can self-generate Phantasm stacks and keep these topped up. These things are crazy. The one thing I will say, if you're not going to run these, there is something interesting to be said about the fact that they apply the Q hits through counters. So if you're not running Wraithblades specifically, then the Q is interesting for things like running a chill thing where you can kind of apply chill and then throw a frostbat. So you can chill through their counter and then immediately hit them with a frostbat, or maybe like a Veil of Frost Veil attack, right? Where you do this and then freeze them that way after you landing the Q off the dagger. So there is something to be said about that kind of, but if you're not playing something very specific like that, there's just so many ways to add chill, so I just don't think that's all that big a deal. So if you're not playing something very specific like that, just run these things and explode things. Then in PvE, these things are, I mean, they're the highest damaging PvE weapon in the entire game. Nothing comes close, and if you say otherwise, you don't know what you're talking about. All right, these things are hilarious. I didn't know, so if you wanted to know, Winged Horror has a thing. Let me do this real quick. So let me swap stuff up here. Winged Horror has a thing where if you do enough damage to Winged Horror in a short enough amount of time, he will be staggered. And now the only time I thought that was only a normal mode thing, normal mode thing. I had no idea that that also worked on the this guy right here, the brutal version, where if you do enough damage to this guy through all of the different static stacks and whatever, you can stagger him like this. I had no idea you could do that in brutal winged horror. But I found out whenever I fought him with the Wraithblades. So there's nothing that comes close to how strong these things are in PvE damage-wise, and they have an iframe on Q. So if you need a lot of safety, I would say Endbringers, and if you need also a lot of safety but hilarious amounts of damage, then run the Wraithblades. Now we're up to Fate Dancers. This thing is fantastic. I would say this is the best in slot Twin Blade overall. I don't really see why you would build a Twin Blade for a specific infusion on the Q unless you're doing something like a mobbing, right? But PvP, I don't think it matters. Like, why do I care what is on my Q infusion? Because you're not really using it a ton. I mean, you can if you want to, but the thing is too, not only do you, if you do care, well, it just so happens that Chill is arguably the best infusion in the game right now. Or I mean, Static is great too, I guess, and Condemn is great. All these things are great. There's ways they enable passives, but not only does Chill enable combos like this, right, where you chill them and then you can freeze them like this, but also it has Cold Soul, which means all of your damage to them is increased by 8% as well, which is the same thing as things like Sanguine Mastery for physical damage or Spiritual Infusion for spell damage. So these things are amazing. This thing's amazing in that regard, the way it works. If you want to see that more specifically, again, I have a video for this. The initial hit applies Chill, and then the recall will consume Chill to freeze. You can see this right here. So I don't actually have anything on there, so that did Chill there. I didn't have my Frostbat on that I thought I did. Where am I? There we go. So if you go like this, right? Here we go. This thing will come back, and then it freezes them like that. So, and then the E does 50% bonus damage to chilled or frozen enemies, which is just a straight upgrade over the regular E. And like I said, because there's so much chill going around, just being able to do extra damage like that is amazing. PvE Twin Blade is amazing. I would say for me, it kind of works for like almost like a caster thing if you want it to, because of like a long range poke like this to hit that, and then you do like a spell in front of you, something like Reign of Chaos, and you can throw this thing like this and then go like this and then start casting Reign of Chaos. It'll pull all the mobs into the Reign of Chaos, kind of group them all in one spot, and they all start getting exploded by it. All right, and now we're at Oaksong. Sadly, this is one of the bad ones in my opinion. I don't really see in PvP why you would ever use this. Maybe I just am... No, I'm not wrong on this. You don't use... if you're using Oaksong in PvP, you're kind of trolling in my opinion. One of the biggest, most important things about the longbow is that the Q... The purple version, the Q is such a massive AoE, very strong knockback, get off me tool, and the purple versions have infusions. So you can have things like Chaos Infusion to deal chaos damage and enable things like Renewing Flames bonus damage, bonus spell damage, Weaken to enable things like bonus weaken damage. You can even have this if you wanted to. You can have Leech Blood is better than the Oaksong because it enables things like Sanguine Mastery. You can have Weaken like this to enable this, so you can do this right here. So you have like a Weaken, and then you can swap to this and get a Fear. So Weaken Crossbow Q, Siren's Wail, E for a Fear. All of those things are extremely powerful. And because you don't have an infusion on Oaksong, you just lose that completely. The only kind of infusion you can really get is if you put Power Surge on it specifically and do that, you can get an infusion on the Q, but is that worth it? No. Each hit granting focus, who cares? That does nothing. It doesn't benefit what you used Longbow for in PvP. So who cares about that? And then the E is one of the worst PvP abilities in the entire game. I would say it's probably the second worst one overall. I think the worst one altogether is probably Pistol Q. The second worst one is very likely going to be this. The reason is it's just way too telegraphed when it comes out. And obviously, like if they stand there and they're disconnected from the video game and you hit this, yeah, that's going to do a huge amount of damage. But again, that would require them to be DC'd to get hit by the entirety of that, because that is how long it takes to go off. And it would also require them to not be near anything, because if they are, oops, sorry, like this, because if they are close to a wall, it just hits the wall and immediately stops. So overall, Oaksong, bad for PvP. It's the worst possible thing for PvP, in my opinion. I don't know why you would ever use this. E, on the other hand, this thing is cracked, because every single hit on the Q applies focus. So what happens is you can get your focus like this, and you can Q for bonus damage and then immediately get more focus back to then immediately get a huge E like that can also hit through multiple enemies. Again, we'll showcase this like this, right? We have 3 stacks, big damage there, and then we can do this. And then finally, the humble Mortira's Lament. I love this weapon. It has some really cool interactions for you to consider here. So what you can do with this, obviously what happens, the way that Mortira's Lament works is that the Q consumes up to 3 allied skeletons to heal yourself by 50% of your spell power per skeleton, and increasing your spell and physical power per skeleton by 10% for 8 seconds. This is what you would call a Disneyland combo. If you can land this, it's crazy. It's so ridiculous. So 100% chance to spawn a skeleton warrior for each enemy hit. Now there's 3 skeleton warriors, and now I have 73 physical power right here. Then I have bonus damage here. You can see I can just do crazy damage. So let's do this one more time here. Summon all these skeletons, Q them for 73, and then you hit this. I mean, you can just see all that damage is just crazy. So that's kind of what the Q does. And then also I'm healing myself for 50% of my spell power for every one of those skeletons. 8 seconds is a really long time. The thing is, getting that to work is unreasonable a lot of times, so you can't really bank on that. However, there is something very interesting you might consider. I've thought about this before, where if you are running a thing like the Unyielding Charger, and then you are attacking something and it summons this skeleton, you can actually consume it like that for a quick heal and a quick power and spell power boost to have that happen. Also, if you're running something like Ward of the Damned, right, where you have like the knockback, you're summoning skeletons whenever something hits it, you can technically do that, knock it back, and then you could eat all your skeletons that way as well. That is a possibility. And then the second part of this is the E applies Condemn. It's one of the only things. It's actually the only thing in the game, I believe that. Oh no, I guess Claws can too now. Second thing in the game that can apply Condemn on the E like this, which is super powerful for combo potential. So if your ally is like spear queuing somebody, if you're able to throw this on while they're spear queuing, you are going to just obliterate somebody with that, because you have Condemn and it's hitting 1,000,000 times while they're static spear queuing someone. But overall, Mortira's Lament also kind of works well for spell power builds, I would say, if you want to, because especially for summoning skeletons. Something that I was doing that was kind of funny with Soulburn with this weapon specifically, someone was running a skeleton build. I was hard countering them with Bloodrite and Soulburn, because instead of the chance to spawn skeleton warriors, I was running that, but I was also this thing applies Condemn, and so I would kill the skeleton warriors, I would summon my own skeleton warriors, and I would kill their skeleton warriors that had Condemn, so I would summon more skeleton warriors, and then I would queue with Reaper, and I was just walking around with like 70 physical power while I was fighting them. Almost the entire fight was very funny. So it kind of hard counters skeletons if you run something like that in a way, but otherwise that's kind of niche. Anyway, sorry, this is rambling. It's just super fun here. Overall, for PvP, fine weapon. There's other things you can do, because the infusion on the Q is generally a really big deal for PvP on Reapers. But if you don't want to run this thing specifically, you're really not going to lose out on all that much, because it is actually still very strong. And then for PvP, Reapers are incredibly good for PvE, especially for bossing, because the enemy's hitbox is so big. You just throw that E on somebody, hits 1,000,000 times. You can also summon skeletons, which distracts them. This is best in slot for Reapers, in my opinion, for PvE. because also you can do this and get huge bonuses to all your stuff and then do even bigger damage. So all in all, that is going to be it for now. This got really long, but we had to break everything down here for you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments. But regardless, that is going to be it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one.